إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن نبينا محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا مزيدا أما بعد فأوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله جل وعلا فلا سعادة إلا بالتقوى ولا فلاح إلا بطاعة المولى قال ربنا جل وعلا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون وقال تعالى يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا وقال تعالى يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما إن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وأحسن الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار من أطاع الله ورسوله فقد رشد ومن يعص الله ورسوله فقد ضل وغوى. All praise and thanks and glory is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Almighty alone. We praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala no matter the situation and no matter the circumstances we find ourselves in. We remind ourselves of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all around us. وَرَحْمَتِي وَسِعَتْ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ. My mercy has encompassed everything. We remind ourselves of the countless blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues to send down upon us. وَإِن تَعُدُّوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ لَا تُحْصُوهَا. If you are to count the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will not be able to count and enumerate them. The greatest blessing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, without a doubt, is the blessing of Al-Islam. And after that, from His blessings is that He has allowed us to witness another blessed day of Al-Jumu'ah. He has given us life on this blessed day of Al-Jumu'ah. He has allowed us to come here and gather in this blessed gathering of Al-Jumu'ah, a gathering of forgiveness, a gathering of mercy, a gathering of blessings. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He make this gathering of ours a weekly source of forgiveness, mercy and blessings. Ameen. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He make us among those that are constantly thankful and grateful to Him. Allahumma ja'alna laka shakirin wa laka dhakirin. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. My dear brothers and sisters, without a doubt everyone is following what's going on in Palestine. We know what's going on in Gaza. I'm sure this past week we've been constantly being updated, constantly reading up, constantly seeing what's going on. And subhanAllah, the images and the videos and everything that we're getting is obviously, words can't describe the level of heart-wrenching it is, how gut-wrenching it is, how saddened it makes us. And subhanAllah, words just cannot even describe, right? We're constantly talking amongst ourselves, we're making dua. The fact that you have over 2 million people in an area where there is no way of any aid to come in, there is no escape from them to go out. And subhanAllah, on top of that, constant bombardment over bombardment and bombardment, over and over and over again, in a large cage, you can say, subhanAllah. I mean, what can we say about a situation like that? And our hearts are without a doubt devastated. We're extremely sad, we're extremely disheartened, and we only can turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and we complain to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we beg Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we ask, we implore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant victory to our brothers and sisters that are suffering in Gaza and of course all around the world. As believers, when we see images, when we see videos like this, right? without doubt, it makes us sad, right? It makes our heart cry. And we remind ourselves, my dear brothers and sisters, amongst everything that is going on, I'm sure many of us are reading up and trying to educate ourselves and being aware of what's going on. The angle that I want to focus on today is the consolement that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us. How Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala consoles the believers during extreme times of difficulty. And we start off right how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that what the believer faces when he is about to leave the world. And this is console. This is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala consoles the hearts of the believers. When we see certain images, we see people dying unjustly, right, out of oppression. One of the things that we can remind ourselves with is what the righteous believer sees as they are leaving the dunya, right? And it brings to us a small level of comfort, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that in Surah Ghafir, He says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا رَبُّنَا اللَّهُ ثُمَّ اسْتَقَامُوا, that indeed those that say our Rabb is Allah, ثُمَّ اسْتَقَامُوا, and they stay steadfast, right? They stay upon the deen. They don't give up their religion, right? He subhanahu wa ta'ala says at the time of death, تَتَنَزَّلُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْمَلَائِكَةِ, the angels, they come to that person, right? The angels, they come to that person. And subhanAllah, what we're looking at, we're talking about thousands of people dying in such quick moments. But subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says for each and every one of a righteous servant, each and every one of the righteous people, the angels, they come down to that person. And what do they tell them? They say, أَلَّا تَخَافُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا, that don't be afraid, right? Don't be afraid about what's to come, right? Last night you slept worried about what's going to happen tomorrow, right? Last night you were sleeping worried about your family, right? Your community, your homes, right? You're worried, constantly in a state of worry and fear and anxiety. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the angels, they come down in that moment and they tell the believer that you don't have to be afraid anymore. There is no more worry anymore, right? You don't have to be afraid anymore. أَلَّا تَخَافُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا, and don't be grieved, don't be sad about what has happened in the past, right? In the dunya, you're saddened, your homes are destroyed, your family is gone, right? What takes place constantly, day after day, is saddening you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the angels will come down and say, don't grieve anymore, any longer. Our Prophet ﷺ tells us in a beautiful narration that, explaining on this concept, he says that the angels, they come down and the believer, بُشِّرَ بِرِضْوَانِ اللَّهِ وَكَرَامَتِهِ, that the believer is given the glad tidings of the mercy of Allah, the happiness, the pleasure of Allah, and how Allah will honor them in the next life. So over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the angels, they come down in that very moment and give them comfort. أَلَّا تَخَافُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا. And as they are getting comfort, when we recite a verse like this, when we remind ourselves about these verses, it gives us a level of comfort, right? وَأَبْشِرُوا بِالْجَنَّةِ, and have the glad tidings of Jannah that you have been promised. نَحْنُ أَوْلِيَاؤُكُمْ فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ, that we are your allies in the hayat, in this life, and in the akhirah. And of course in the akhirah you will get whatever you wish. وَلَكُمْ فِيهَا مَا تَشْتَهِي أَنفُسُكُمْ وَلَكُمْ فِيهَا مَا تَدَّعُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even takes it a level further for those that die in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And without a doubt, our brothers and sisters that stay on the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, while they're being killed unjustly, out of oppression, without a doubt that this is dying for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us in multiple times, multiple places in the Quran, لَا تَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ قُتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتًا, that don't think, don't even consider for a moment that those that die in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they are deceased, that they have died. بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ يُرْزَقُونَ, that rather they are alive with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He subhanahu wa ta'ala is providing for them, right? And the beautiful thing about these verses is that this particular verse came down in the context of the Battle of Uhud. And we should be aware of what took place in the Battle of Uhud, the quote-unquote loss that the believers suffered, that the Muslims suffered, right? And not only did they suffer the loss, many of the bodies of the companions that were recovered after the battle were completely mutilated. Body parts were cut off, and you know what goes on in mutilation. And subhanAllah, you could just imagine the pain that the companions were feeling in that moment. That they're recovering the bodies of people that they were so close with, that were killed in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and even in death there was no justice, that they were mutilated. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminded them with this verse, that don't think that that's it, that they have left. But أَحْيَاءٌ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ يُرْزَقُونَ. That indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is providing for them in the next life. And this is something that we want to constantly remind ourselves with, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He grants those that are dying unjustly, that are dying out of oppression, that are being killed out of oppression, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them this high level, this high status, and accept them as shuhada. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also gives, also consoles us, if we can please move forward as brothers are coming in, also consoles those that are alive, us here. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us in Surah Al-Imran, in the same context of Uhud, it was revealed. He subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَهِنُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا. That for those of you that are alive, لَا تَهِنُوا. Don't put yourselves down. Don't feel like you've lost. Don't give up. Don't stop. Right? Constantly have that hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا. And don't grieve. Right? Obviously the natural grief is there. We know that. Right? A person feels grief in his heart. Our Prophet ﷺ, when he was holding his granddaughter in his arms, in front of the companions, tears were coming out of his eyes. And the companions, they were asking him, Ya Rasulullah, what is this? Because he ﷺ was the strongest of Iman, obviously. And he told them that everyone has an appointed time in this dunya. But yet tears were coming out of his eyes. And the companions were asking him, Ya Rasulullah, what is this? And he said that these are signs of rahmah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places in the heart of the believers. And then he said that whoever doesn't show mercy will not have mercy shown upon him. So obviously the natural grief is there. However, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us that we shouldn't grieve to a point where we stop, to the point where we give up, that we lose hope in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, وَلَا تَهِنُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا وَأَنْتُمُ الْأَعْلَوْنَ. That you are on top, you are victorious, in kuntum mu'mineen. As long as you stay with your iman, as long as you stay believers, you will be victorious. That there is no victory in this dunya if your iman is given up. But as long as you have that iman, inshallah, by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will always be on top. If you die in this way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you the greatest of rewards. This is a victory for the believers. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminded the companions, and we remind ourselves now as well. وَلَا تَهِنُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا وَأَنْتُمُ الْأَعْلَوْنَ إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ إِن يَمْسَسْكُمْ قَرْحٌ فَقَدْ مَسَّ الْقَوْمَ قَرْحٌ مِثْلُهُ. That when you are afflicted with difficulty, with hardship, know that others, they also will face hardships and difficulties, and they also had hardships and difficulties. Your enemies will also face this. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the verse that we remind ourselves, وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. And these days of victory and loss, the days of hardship and happiness, victory and loss, نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. We alternated between people. We alternated. You may be suffering right now. You may be going through difficulty right now. Our brother and sister may be getting killed right now. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us that this will be alternating. Right? Don't think for a moment that the enemies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be able to get away. That day will come. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises us. That day will come. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, لا تحسبن الذين كفروا معجزين في الأرض. Don't think for a moment that those that disbelieve that they are making Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala incapable. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no authority over them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us the question, أَمْ حَسِبَ الَّذِينَ يَعْمَلُونَ السَّيِّئَاتِ أَن يَسْبِقُونَ. That do you think that those that are committing evil, those that are committing oppression, those that are murdering people, you think they'll be able to escape us? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking us this rhetorical question. And without a doubt, we believe that no one is able to escape the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That time will come. We may be going through difficulty, hardship. Our brothers and sisters are going through extreme levels of difficulties. As we mentioned, we can't even describe with our words. But know for a moment and believe, don't lose hope, that day will come that those that are oppressed, Those that kill unjustly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold them accountable, will cause them to face this in this dunya and in the akhirah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He hasten victory for the believers. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. To conclude, we remind ourselves there's so much that we can talk about. Just a few steps that we can do. Firstly is to constantly educate and bring awareness. Right? Educate ourselves first and foremost what exactly is going on. This is not about nation versus nation. This is for us as believers, this is an issue of the ummah. Right? We need to bring awareness to this, that this is not only for a certain group of people. The entire ummah should be aware of what's going on. Should educate ourselves first, educate our children. We've heard over the past week that many kids they're going to school and they're getting certain comments, certain things directed at them. Our kids should be aware of what's going on, right? Not what's being said in the media and what's in the news from us. What actually is taking place. We should educate them so they're able to respond. They're able to speak up. They're able to bring awareness to those around them as well. For us, if people ask us, right, at work, at different places, where do you stand? What's your position? You should be able to proudly say where you stand. It's not an area where you're hiding, right? The very least we can do is speak up and speak to others and bring awareness about this. And subhanAllah, one of the most beautiful tools that we have, when we talk about the negative aspect of it a lot, is social media, right? Social media has given us a platform that in the past we did not have, right? Before, whatever was on the news, whatever was on TV, that used to be the only source of information. But subhanAllah, if you've been, whoever has social media, if you've been following on Twitter and WhatsApp and so on and so forth, we've been seeing how even though there's that narrative out there, right, our Muslim brothers and sisters are constantly trying to bring awareness and showing us live, actual videos of incidents that are taking place and showing the oppression. And it's very important that if you are on social media or you have a platform, you share these videos, you bring awareness through that, so that one narrative isn't pushed, that we push the true narrative, what we know to be true, and we bring awareness to everyone else. Same thing on WhatsApp. We've been seeing a lot of messages being forwarded, constantly keep forwarding what we know to be true. Right? Don't give up, and this actually has an impact on many people. SubhanAllah, I was just following some of the more well-known people that they were saying certain things, obviously, in support. And if you look at the comments, even from the president, right, whatever statement he gave out, if you look at the comments, SubhanAllah, I was amazed to see how many people are actually speaking against him. They're saying, what are you talking about? So it shows that this awareness has an impact on those around us, and it's very important that we constantly do this. And last, and definitely not least, is we constantly remain in the state of dua. If everyone can please move up. We constantly make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when we make dua, we need to make dua honestly from the bottom of our hearts. If your own blood brother, if your parents, if your blood sister, if people that you're close with, if they were going through a hardship, how would you make dua? How would you turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That same way we need to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the bonds of iman is stronger, without a doubt, than the bonds of blood. So this is something that we constantly need to do. Constantly make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our prayers, in our sujood, outside our prayers, whenever we remember them. Today is Friday, the day of where dua is accepted. Our Prophet ﷺ said that there's a moment in time, and many of the scholars have said it's the last hour before Salatul Maghrib, the last moments before Maghrib time comes in. It's a time where the believer turns to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala making dua. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not turn his dua away. It's very important that we take advantage of today and constantly other moments that we're constantly in a state of making dua. We ask and we beg and we implore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He have mercy on our brothers and sisters, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant ease to them, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them victory, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasten victory for them, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deals with the oppressors in the way they deserve to be dealt. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy on all of us. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين استغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله على إحسانه وشكر له على توفيقه وامتنانه وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له تعظيما لشأنه وأشهد أن نبينا محمدا عبده ورسوله الداعي إلى رضوانه والهادي إلى إحسانه صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا مزيدا. أما بعد فاعلموا رحمني الله وإياكم أن الله تعالى أمركم بأمر عظيم بدأ فيه بنفسه وثنى بملائكته وثلث بكم أيها المؤمنون من جنه وإنسه، فقال قولا كريما: إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك وأنعم على نبينا محمد، وارض اللهم عن خلفائه الراشدين الأئمة المهديين أبي بكر وعمر وعثمان وعلي، وعن سائر صحابته أجمعين، وعن التابعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين، وعنا معهم بعفوك وجودك وكرمك ورحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين، اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين، اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين، وأذل الشرك والمشركين، ودمر أعداء الدين، وانصر إخواننا المستضعفين. اللهم انصر إخواننا المستضعفين في فلسطين، اللهم انصر إخواننا المستضعفين في فلسطين، اللهم انصر إخواننا المستضعفين في غزة، اللهم انصر إخواننا المستضعفين في جميع بلاد المسلمين، اللهم انصر إخواننا المستضعفين في كل مكان يا رب العالمين. اللهم عليك بأعداء الدين فإنهم لا يعجزونك، اللهم منزل الكتاب سريع الحساب هازم الأحزاب اهزم اليهود الغاصبين والصهاينة المعتدين، اللهم اهزمهم وزلزلهم، اللهم احصهم عددا واقتلهم بددا ولا تغادر منهم أحدا، اللهم حرر المسجد الأقصى من براثن الغاصبين المعتدين، اللهم حرر وطهر المسجد الأقصى من براثن الغاصبين المعتدين المحتلين. اللهم عليك بأعداء الدين فإنهم لا يعجزونك، اللهم أرنا فيهم عجائب قدرتك، اللهم أرنا فيهم عجائب قدرتك، اللهم إن إخواننا جياع فأطعمهم، وحفاة فاحملهم، وعراة فاكسهم، اللهم اشف مرضاهم، اللهم ارحم موتاهم، اللهم تقبل شهداءهم، اللهم تقبل شهداءهم، اللهم تقبل شهداءهم. اللهم من أرادنا وأراد الإسلام والمسلمين بسوء فأشغله في نفسه واجعل تدبيره تدميره يا سميع الدعاء. اللهم احفظ الإسلام والمسلمين في كل مكان، اللهم نفس كرب المكروبين وفرج هم المهمومين واقض الدين عن المدينين واشف مرضانا ومرضى المسلمين وارحم موتانا وموتى المسلمين. اللهم اجعل نداءنا مرفوعا ودعاءنا مسموعا ومقبولا. اللهم ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم، وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم، واغفر لنا ولوالدينا ولجميع المسلمين الأحياء منهم والميتين إنك أنت الغفور الرحيم. وصل اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. وقم الصلاة.